Well, good day. I don't know whether I'm speaking in the morning or the evening at the OSBA virtual meeting, but I am David Hughes with Rockbridge Trees down in Tennessee. I normally am a vendor there at the OSBA meeting in Plain City, Ohio. And it is about to be November, and it's just as cold down here as it is up there this year, which is a little unusual. Our subject today is going to be trees for bees. We generally think about our bees and where they get their nectar from and their pollen from. Our perspective of the world is somewhat terrestrial. We are somewhere under 7 feet tall, and our world is mostly somewhat under 7 feet tall. And we are constrained to our part of the world, but honeybees are not. They can go much higher and much farther than we can. And they are, their world is a little different from ours. They see the world a little differently than ours. Most of us, our first experience with honeybees is seeing them as young people, and seeing them on the clover or maybe on the flowers in the flower bed. And that's where we think of honeybees doing their work, is down there on the ground. And honeybees are nowhere near limited to that. They go to the highest treetops, and the highest treetops on the highest mountaintops if they're within their range. Your bees will travel from 3 to as much as 5 miles away from the hive that they're in to find nectar and pollen sources. That is the possible range. The most effective range is much shorter than that. So if you can have forage for your bees that is appealing to your bees, that is a few hundred yards away, it's kind of like this. If you go to the far corner of the farm and you want something out of the refrigerator, it takes you a while to get to it and get back to where you were. Whereas if the recliner is within reach of the refrigerator, it doesn't take near as long to get there and to make the trip back. And you can make more trips in a day that way, and you use much less energy. And that's the goal for our bees, is to make that trip shorter, make them more efficient, make them do more trips per day. The more trips they make, the more nectar and pollen they can harvest. The more nectar and pollen they can harvest, the more honey they make. The more honey they make, the happier they are and the happier we are. So why do we talk about trees and shrubs and things like that? What is the big deal about that? Well, there's a couple of things that, we don't really think about, but 2 mature American linden trees, basswood trees, are equal to an entire acre of sweet clover. An acre of those, which is 15 or so American linden trees, can produce up to 1,500 pounds of honey in one season. An acre of black locust trees can produce up to 1,500 pounds of honey in just a few weeks. If you've got those kinds of resources available, you probably don't have enough bees to produce the maximum amount that is available from those sources. The volume of a tree as opposed to the volume, if you've got white clover and the bees are really working the white clover, they're using 12 inches of space in an acre. If you've got an acre of tulip poplar trees, they're using 90 feet deep on an acre of ground. So the volume of plant material that's there, the volume of flowers that there, is exponentially greater than the volume of flowers that's, in even a perennial or annual flower crop. Trees are more seasonal, where you might get a longer bloom period from clover. Sometimes the trees come and go in just a few weeks. but the volume of nectar that's available in one spot is much, much greater. I'm going to talk about bloom periods and bloom times. I know from talking to people in Ohio, from southern Ohio to northern Ohio, can be a multi-week difference in bloom times on the same species of tree. So the bloom times that I'm going to talk about are approximate. I'm in Tennessee. We have mild weather in sometimes in January and February, where northern Ohio is not likely to have blooms quite as early as these are. But the sequence is the same, whether they bloom in February or whether they don't bloom till the end of March. So we'll talk about them in sequence and go that route. The year begins with wind pollinated flowers for the most part. We've got as a flower that produces nectar and pollen both. Fragrant honeysuckle is one of the first ones. It's a shrub. It's an old shrub, been around for hundreds of years. This one was planted in the dooryards of the farms back in the colonial times and frontier times. The winter time on the farm, everything's frozen. All kinds of noxious things pile up frozen through the winter time, and springtime would come. And it was very nice to have something in the dooryard that smelled good, because there were a lot of bad smells on the farm early in the year. And this was always at the doorway or at the garden gate or whatever of the farm. And it blooms. It'll bloom in Tennessee as early as February, maybe March before northern Ohio sees flowers from this. It's a very good pollen and nectar source. It is a honeysuckle. This one can spread. It is not highly invasive. I rarely see one of these that is not in cultivation. So it's not as worrisome as some of the other bush honeysuckles that you see around. The next things, we've got several wind pollinated things. We've got willows, we've got elms, then we get maples. The bees are collecting pollen from these wind pollinated plants, the willows and the elms. Pollen is a protein source. That's what they feed the brood with. It's very important to kick off the season and have some idea. Helps the queen to know that it's time to lay eggs. She's got food coming into the hive. The workers have got something to do. They're not all just sitting around cleaning and taking care of her. They've got something coming into the hive. It's a signal that spring has begun. Willows are fairly early. Elms are probably the very earliest bloom. These are the male flowers that you see on the screen here. They are pollen only. This is the first thing that makes your nose run in the springtime. But it is also a very important pollen source for your bees, and it just really helps them to know that the season is turning, and the queen can begin to lay eggs without worrying about them running out of food and stores and whatnot. Red maple, the red maple, silver maple, and sugar maple are all three fairly early. Red maple and silver maple produce nectar and pollen. I've seen my bees work this with snow on the ground. The other thing that happens in the spring, y'all are all familiar with maple syrup. There's a little woodpecker out there called the yellow-bellied sapsucker. The yellow-bellied sapsucker is the one that drills those little lines of holes around your tree. And when the temperature is above freezing in the daytime, below freezing at night, it causes the sap to flow. When the sap flows, that's a sugar source. and the bees will work that pretty heavily if it's close. They won't travel very far for it, but if your bees are near maple trees, they will. I've seen bees work maple sap on my maple trees in the early spring with 6 or 8 inches of snow on the ground, and the bees will get out on the, it's 45 degrees. The bees will get on the front of the hive. They'll sun will warm them up. They'll run over to the tree, fill up on maple sap, and run back to the hive. They always work on the south side of the tree, and it's a very good source of sugar for the trees, natural source for the bees, and it doesn't hurt the tree for that sap to run. That's a natural part of that process. Let's see here. Redbuds are this is the beginning of the serious nectar flow in the springtime. So you're going to see, you start seeing redbuds, the game is on. It's beginning to take off. And you're going to see, I've heard some people say, rarely do you ever get a concentrated amount of flowers where you actually have pure redbud honey. I've had some people say that they took some off right after the redbud flow, and it was absolutely totally inedible. Very bitter, acrid, not very nice stuff. Honeybees don't seem to care, and that mixed in with the rest of your nectar sources would be part of what gives your honey its special flavor. These flowers are in the pea family. That's a kind of a pea-shaped flower. The seed is a little bean. It's a legume. Honeybees absolutely love this thing. They will work it in foul weather, good weather. It doesn't really matter. They really like it. But this is the beginning of the nectar flow. About this time, right after the redbuds, dogwoods bloom. Dogwoods really don't seem to do anything for a honeybee. They're pretty flowers for us, but and native bees will work pollen on them, but honeybees don't do much with them. You've got Carolina silverbell, Allegheny serviceberry. Those are both early April and May flowers. The silverbell produces some nectar, but a lot of pollen. Bees have to work it upside down. Those upside down flowers are nice because they're not as susceptible to wind and rain as the upright flowers are. Serviceberry, there's a lot of serviceberry planted around Ohio in road medians and whatnot. It's in the apple family. It's a very nice source of nectar, and the little berries are very tasty. You can keep the birds away from them. They make very good jellies and jams, and they have a very high vitamin C content. This is something that you really don't think about with honeybees. Oaks and hickories are wind pollinated. The female flowers look like little tiny nuts with a little sticky end on them. Don't really produce any nectar, but they are massive pollen producers. They're wind pollinated. These are the male flowers. The left-hand picture is the oak. The right-hand picture is a hickory. They produce copious amounts of pollen. Pollen being a protein source, very important for your honeybees. The interesting thing about this is there are lots and lots of oaks and hickories out there, and the honeybees don't work them at random. Matter of fact, they don't work anything at random. They find a good source, they report back to the hive, and then they're loyal to that source. So we had a guy here in Tennessee who had 2 pecan trees in his front yard. They're blooming at the same time. The one on the left had bees all over it. The one on the right, just 20 or 30 feet away, didn't have any bees on it at all. So you won't see honeybees on every oak tree and every hickory tree, but if you find them working one, you may find quite a few bees working that. Now this is going to happen here in Tennessee in April, possibly after mid-April, after frost. Might be into the first week or two of May in Ohio. But this is you know, part of the progression of the seasons. Next thing comes is we begin to get into May here. We get wild cherry, black cherry. It's in the rose family. It's a huge number of flowers, very good nectar source, very important nectar source for your bees. This is a kind of a pioneer species. You find it in old overgrown farm fields and fence rows and whatnot. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of fence rows like we once did, so there's not as much of this available as there once was. But if you happen to live in an area where you've got a lot of regrowing land, regrowing young timber and whatnot, there'll be a lot of black cherry in it. You can look at these. There are hundreds of flowers in each one of those clusters. They bloom over the course of a couple of weeks. Some of those flowers open every day. It's a good concentrated source of nectar for your bees. They can get a lot from one location, which is very important. That having to look for a new flower every time you make a trip costs a lot of energy and a lot of time. Where they go back to the same source day after day after day, and it's well worth their effort. They don't have to hunt around for new sources. Black locust, as I said earlier, an acre of these can produce up to 1,500 pounds of honey. The issue of black locust, and you'll hear this talked about amongst beekeepers, is they have on years and off years. And that is an issue of flower production and weather. This is a pea-like flower, kind of like the redbud flower. It hangs in long clusters, and they're very susceptible to wind and rain. Those flowers open up and you get a big thunderstorm that blows through. It can shake those flowers enough to shake most of the nectar and pollen out of them. And that just means there's nothing there for the bees, and they'll move on to something else. If you have a nice warm spring and calm weather for 10 days or so during the black locust bloom, you'll get just gobs of honey out of this. The other issue can be if you have an on year where you have a lot of flowers and a lot of successful pollination, so the tree is really heavily got a lot of seeds on it. The energy required from the tree to hang all those seeds will cause it to not bloom as much or even at all the next year, and that's called alternate bearing. And that can be a problem with heavily blooming trees like this also. It's just a part of the physiology of the plant. It puts a lot of energy into reproduction one year, and it takes a year off and doesn't produce as many flowers. And then the next year it'll do that again. What breaks that cycle usually is bad weather during pollination on a good year. And then you'll have, the next year you'll have an equal number of flowers to a good year. Let's see, tulip poplar. Tulip poplar is a fairly common tree where there's woodlands. Those great big flowers as big as your hand are supposed to have a tablespoon of nectar in the bottom of each flower. They also have a lot of pollen in that flower. A lot of people never see a bee work one of these flowers because they're way up in the top of a 90-foot tall tree. That brings up another thing about trees and such things. When I recommend people plant trees for their bees, you're far better off to plant a savanna rather than a forest. So plant your trees 40 or 50 feet apart for large trees. You can put smaller trees closer together, but large trees 40 or 50 feet apart, The formula is sunlight equals flowers equals fruit. So if the tree is shaded, if you go in the woods and look at a tulip poplar tree, you'll see all of the seed pods are in the top third of the tree, which is 90 feet up in the air. If you find that same species out in a cow pasture or hay field, out in the wide open spaces, you'll find flowers all the way to the ground, as far down as sunlight can reach. I have one in my yard that has branches that hang down in the way of the lawnmower. They just droop down that far. And I have flowers at eye level all the way to the top of that tree. So the more sunlight a tree gets, the more flowers it's going to produce. If they're crowded together, shade reduces the energy level to the tree, and those flowers need to be up near the sun where there's plenty of energy to aid reproduction. But these things are supposed to have a tablespoon of nectar in the bottom of every flower. The honey from a tulip poplar is a dark, almost black honey. If you have a good year and you have a few frames that are really dark and you're wondering where that came from, that's likely to be tulip poplar. The only other thing that I see that's really dark like that is buckwheat. And it has a similar flavor. It's a strong molassesy, kind of a peppery flavor. I kind of like it. Some people like it a lot. Some people don't like it at all. If you're adventuresome and want to take the time and just extract the frames that have tulip poplar honey in them separately, you can kind of market that as a different flavored honey. I'm all about people trying to figure out better ways to market their product and not just try to compete with commodity products. Your honey from your farm is as individual as any product in the world. Your neighbor 5 miles down the road, his honey will not taste the same as yours. A beekeeper in southern Ohio, his honey is going to taste different than a beekeeper in northern Ohio. It's different flower combinations. If you happen to farm next to a field of canola and make canola honey, then you've got a different product than somebody 10 miles down the road who's only working with wildflowers. So differentiate your product as best as you can, and as much as you're willing to, and then use that as part of your marketing tools to sell your honey and have a different product. There are other things that are blooming this time of year. Buckeye, Ohio buckeye. Let's see, we'll go back here. Your catalpas are blooming. Persimmon, nobody really thinks about persimmons being a bee plant, but American persimmon is a very productive nectar source. The blooms are only open for about 7 days, so it's a very short window, but the bees just mob that tree. And there are male and female trees. The female trees produce a copious amount of nectar, and the male trees produce a copious amount of pollen, and the bees will work those back and forth to pollinate those trees. And I can remember, several years ago, right after we got bees here, I was working one day. It was very still and calm, and I could hear bees just roaring over on the farm next door. And I thought, oh man, there's a swarm over there. I'm going to go get that. And I hopped the fence and ran over there, and I could hear them around this persimmon tree, and I kept walking around looking for this, bunch of bees. And there was a bunch of bees there. They were on every single branch of that tree working the flowers that were available. They're little tiny little flowers, hard to see, but the bees absolutely love those things. Hollies, this is American holly. Hollies are, if you're in a climate where you can grow hollies are a very important nectar source. Most of the comb honey produced in the United States is produced from gallberry holly. It's called gallberry honey. Comes from South Georgia, South Carolina, North Florida, Southern Alabama, that area. They have about 6 or 7 species of holly that bloom over the course of about a month down there. And they all bloom like these with these massive clusters of flowers. The bees work those things like crazy. They produce a concentrated honey production. All of that honey is made, I've talked to some of those guys, all of that honey is made in 30 days from foundation. They draw the comb, they fill it with nectar, and they finish it off in 30 days. They don't use drawn comb because they don't want anything, they don't want any dirty comb or any muddy looking cappings or anything like that. So they put in just fresh foundation, and the bees draw that comb out and fill it with nectar and dry it off in the course of about 30 days. It's they'll get 3 or 4 supers full of comb honey off of every hive, and they put 200 hives to an out yard. It's a tremendous nectar source. Like I said, it happens very fast. If you don't have those multiple species, American holly will bloom over about 10 days. Inkberry, winterberry, all of those will work. And all of the imported hollies, the Chinese hollies and Japanese hollies, all of the landscape hollies do the same thing. But don't overlook hollies as a part of your landscape plan for your bees, because it's a very good nectar source. One of the things that begins to bloom in May and maybe as late as June where you are is privet. Privet is an excellent bee plant. It's a terrible invasive species. I generally don't, well, I always don't advise people to plant things that are invasive. We have enough problems with our native environment without adding things like privet or Japanese honeysuckle or some of these other things that are taking over our understories of our woodlands. One of the reasons that those plants are so invasive is the deer won't eat them. That was one of the reasons that people planted them as landscape plants to begin with, was the deer wouldn't eat them. Nothing would eat them. And then they produce seed, the birds eat the seed and spread the seeds, and then you've got a problem plant. I mean, even in some states, they consider black locust to be an invasive species because it wasn't native there at the time. It's a hard time figuring out how you have an invasive species that actually lives here, but that's for another discussion. But choose wisely. There are things that golden rain tree will not be invasive in southern Ohio, but if you took somebody in Florida and wanted to plant one, I'd try to discourage it because it really likes Florida and it becomes kind of a weed down there. But so you kind of need to investigate the plants and find out what spreads where you are and what doesn't spread where you are. So we don't want to cause a problem by planting for our bees. Not native is not always invasive. There are a lot of non-native plants that do not invade. They don't. You may occasionally find one out of cultivation, but you're not going to find whole hillsides covered with them. Let's see what we've got next here. Catalpa. Northern Catalpa, up where you all are, seems to be a very good nectar source in the summertime. It seems as though cool nights and warm days makes it a better nectar source. Down here in the south, it's kind of an emergency source. The bees tend to work it when it's very dry and everything else is kind of dried up. That's another thing to talk about these trees. Trees are somewhat drought resistant. They're not entirely drought resistant, but they're somewhat drought resistant, and especially short-term droughts. So, some years we go into April and May and there's no rain, and it turns off hot early, and the clover dries up, and the dandelions dry up, and everything else dries up, and the trees with their larger root system and larger energy base will go ahead and bloom, and they'll go ahead and produce nectar when some of your smaller plants, annuals and perennials, may not produce any nectar. I do see that some people will call and say, hey, you know, the bees aren't working my whatever. And it's because they don't need it. Bees are very loyal to a source. If they're working clover and clover's got a good sugar content, they'll go to that clover and stay on that clover, and they won't look for anything else. So other things will bloom and go and bloom and go, and the bees will never work those things. And then the next year they'll work those things, and they won't work the clover if the clover's not attractive. So we saw that one year with some Vitex here. We had the Vitex began to bloom in the nursery. The bees got on it. They were on it real good. A couple of days later, I thought, well, I'll go out there and take some pictures of the bees on the Vitex. There wasn't a bee to be found. There wasn't a bee anywhere. So I'm like, what happened? I mean, flowers are still there. I don't know what's going on. I'm walking by there about a week later, and there's bees all over it again. Well, when it first started to bloom, it was the best source available. They went to that. Something else came along that had a higher sugar content. They moved off of that and off the Vitex and went to something else. That ran out, or somebody mowed it down or whatever, and then they came back to the Vitex. So just because you plant something and you don't see bees on it doesn't mean that it's not good for the bees, or that they're not going to need it someday, but they may not need it that year. And I have heard that people got something, the bees are on it really good this year and they're not on it at all next year. So don't be discouraged if you've got something and you don't see bees on it right away. They just haven't found it or haven't needed it yet. American linden, basswood tree, and the little leaf linden as well. The little leaf linden is the European linden. Little leaf linden is a common street tree in Dresden, Germany. In Germany, they move their bees into the city for the linden bloom. It produces linden honey over the course of 2 or 3 weeks. And once the linden bloom is over with, they move them back out into the countryside. Linden honey is a very light colored honey. It has a kind of a minty flavor to it. There are huge numbers of flowers. These trees attract every pollinator known to mankind. There'll be lots and lots and lots of bees on this. They are not completely immune to wind and rain, but the flowers do hang upside down, and that does help. It also blooms in June, which usually the weather's calmed down a little bit by June. Not quite as many spring storms and wind events. So a little bit better chance of getting a nectar flow from American linden. It coming in June, your bee numbers are good, your brood numbers are good, you've got drawn comb from your early nectar flow. They got a place to put this. They can really, really crank it out if they've got linden trees nearby. Like I said, 2 mature trees are equal to an acre of sweet clover, and 20 or 25 on an acre can produce as much as 1,500 pounds of honey. It's a very, very good bee tree, very productive. It's a long-lived tree. It gets very large. You don't want to crowd them together. They'll shade each other. Tree lilac. Tree lilac is a small tree. It's really good. It's a street tree. You can go under power lines, go next to a sidewalk, up close to a house, 15 or 20 feet tall. I don't really know how, as far as a honey crop is concerned, how important it is, but I've never seen one blooming anywhere that didn't have bees on it. So the bees obviously like it. this is one of those that's a good additional source. I don't think I'd plant them expecting to get a tree lilac honey crop, but it's a good good secondary source for the bees. Ambermacii, this is a blurry picture, but it's the best one I've got. Ambermacii is a small tree, another good street tree. Only gets about 15 or 20 feet tall. Good for a small space or a small yard. Blooms in June, July, maybe even early August. It has kind of greenish flowers that are very fragrant, and they smell like freshly mown grass. So that one's kind of cool. Sourwood. Sourwood gets me in more trouble than anything else. Everybody wants to argue about sourwood trees, whether they produce nectar at low elevation or whether they, all kind. Everybody's got an opinion about sourwood. Here's kind of the deal with sourwood. Sourwood is those little flower bracts that hang down there like fingers. Those flowers open every day. There's a flower on that little bracket that opens every day for a month. So you've got a long continuous source of nectar there. The honeybees work it everywhere it grows. A lot of people talk about, oh, below 2,000 feet, it doesn't produce nectar and this, that, and another thing. Central Alabama, down below Birmingham, the tail end of the Appalachian Mountains, there's some hill and valley country there around Clanton, Alabama. They have a sourwood honey flow every year. It's fairly low elevation, 500 or 600 feet. The local guys down there make sourwood honey every year. It has to do with the number of trees available. And that's the other thing about varietal honeys. You can, I have sourwood growing in the county that I live in, and I can tell you where a dozen of them are, and they're all 10 miles apart from each other. So there's not enough flowers available in any one place in my county to make a sourwood honey flow that's going to make pure sourwood honey. Are the bees going to work it if they're within the range that the bees can get to it? Of course they're going to work it. Are they going to get nectar from it? Yes, they're going to get nectar from it. Are they going to make pure sourwood honey? Well, for 2 or 3 cells, yeah, they're going to make pure sourwood honey, but are they going to make frames and frames and frames of it? No, they're not. In the mountains of Georgia, North Carolina, East Tennessee, West Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, parts of Virginia in the Shenandoah Valley, they've got mountainsides where every other tree is a sourwood tree. If you've got thousands of trees available, that's an excellent nectar source. The bees are there in numbers to be able to access that nectar source, then yes, you're going to get pure honey from one nectar source. There's not a lot blooming when sourwood blooms. So, for you and your hives, this is a really, a good alternative source to just kind of carry them through those summer months when there's not a lot of nectar flow otherwise. The other thing about sourwood trees is that mountainside thing is really important to these. They do not like wet feet. If you've got flat ground, they can drown in a heavy rainstorm. They need this root system is like a very fine spider web, and it doesn't take a lot of water to drown them. In places where the ground is flat, they need to be planted on a mound, and I'm talking a serious mound, a foot or two tall, so that the water drains off of them right away. They grow in nature, they grow in the awfulest, rockiest, terriblest places that you can think of. I see them growing in road cuts and on bluffs and on ridge tops and just awful, dreadful soil. I've had people plant them in the garden and feed them real heavy, and they just kill them right away because they've just fed them, they've loved them to death. This is a This is a plant that does its best in the worst of circumstances. That's its niche. That's what it likes, is awful places. And it's I've got some people who can grow them. They grow like a weed. They love them to death. And I've got other people that every time they plant one, it dies just almost immediately. So it's not a plant for everybody. It is a challenge to grow. But it's likely to be in southeast Ohio, probably as far north as it needs to be. If you northern Ohio, it's just not going to be hardy. It gets too cold up there, and it is more of a southern plant. Let's see, the Korean BB tree. Everybody wants a BB tree. I have the same trouble growing BB trees that everybody else does. I have a hard time getting them to sprout. And it is a wonderful nectar source. It's a wonderful nectar source. It blooms heavily. Takes 5 or 6 years for it to bloom. It is very attractive to every pollinator out there. A few years ago, we had one bloom in the nursery. We had a very ugly one that had 2 crooks and 3 dog legs, and just got skin up on the bark and was just not a sellable plant. And it had flowers on it. And I had bees that sat on those flowers for 2 weeks before they opened up, waiting on them to open up. You'd go out there in the morning and there'd be this lone honeybee sitting on top of this cluster of flowers covered in dew, just waiting on these things to open up. So it is a good source. It makes a dark honey. I've had some of the honey. It's a dark, spicy honey. And it produces a lot of it. The funny story about this is when I started my nursery, we kind of started by accident. We didn't really need to be in this. We started our nursery to grow pecan trees, and pecan trees were kind of difficult. They had to be grafted, and we weren't very good at grafting at the time. And I happened to be down in McMinnville buying some supplies. We grow produce here also. Getting supplies for the produce business, and the guys down there in the nursery business, and somebody mentioned sourwood tree, and everybody's, oh, don't grow sourwood tree. Can't grow sourwood trees. They won't live, on and on and on. So I thought, well, that sounds like a challenge. I'm going to grow sourwood trees. So I planted sourwood trees, and lo and behold, yes, you can grow sourwood trees, and you can get them to stay alive, and it's not that big a deal. And the other tree that I grew when I started was the American Linden tree, because I never saw one for sale anywhere, because for some reason they're not popular in the landscape business. So we grew these things, and I didn't have any idea who I was going to sell them to. I just grew them because I wanted to grow them, because that's kind of what I do. And we had a fellow who kept bees here at the time, and I had these trees, and I said, hey, what am I going to do with these trees? And he said, well, they're all bee trees. He said, why don't you take them to a bee meeting? And I was like, well, where's a bee meeting? And he said, well, HAS is going to be over in Cookville in about 3 weeks. Why don't you go over there? So I called over there, called them, and they let me set up. And we set up, and lo and behold, we were the first people to ever come to a bee meeting with plants. So it's kind of shock to me, but we got there, and right across the aisle from us was the bee culture booth, and Kim Flottam was in there. And, you know, like most bee meetings, the session ended and the room filled up with beekeepers, and they swarmed us. I mean, they came at us from every direction, asking questions and buying trees and all this sort of stuff. And then you know, like at bee meetings, the session started again and everybody disappeared. Kim Flottam walked over and said, "Hey, you know what a BB tree is?" And I was like, "No, what's a BB tree?" He said, "Find out and grow something." So you know, male and female flowers in the same cluster, but they're not open at the same time. They either the male or the female flowers will open first. They'll bloom for about 2 weeks. They'll close up, and then the other one will bloom. So you have to have several trees around so that at least one of them has male flowers available when the females are available, and females available when the males are available. Pecan trees work the same way. A lot of hickories work the same way, but it's a strategy to not self-pollinate. And it works pretty well, but a lot of people will have a tree and it will make flowers and it will make seeds, but the seeds are not viable. And I think that's one of the problems that we run into when we buy seeds on the internet, is we're buying them from somebody that's got one tree and the seeds are not pollinated. So that's one of the really tricky parts. And I buy seeds from commercial seed sources and I get the same thing. So it's not that, you know, the professionals have an advantage. We're all at a disadvantage. The other thing about this plant is it is not in general cultivation, so we don't know a lot about it. I am finding that it has some of the same troubles that the sourwood tree does. It does not like wet feet. It is subject to some root rots. Tree looks fine today. It rains a lot. A week from now, it looks a little yellow. A week after that, it's deader than a stone. So it needs to be on a well-drained site. It needs adequate moisture, but not too much moisture. It needs adequate fertilizer, but not too much fertilizer. It's not a needy plant. It just needs the right conditions. One that's happy is very happy. They grow very quickly. They do take about 5 years to make flowers. That's not a bad thing, because I'd rather have a big plant with a lot of flowers than a small plant with a few flowers. So that's kind of the thing there. We want to have plenty of flowers on our trees. Japanese pagoda, that's in the pea family. I tell people this is a black locust that doesn't have any thorns. So this is a big tree. It blooms midsummer, June, July. Lots of flowers, very attractive to honeybees, makes a good honey flow. One tree can produce quite a bit of nectar, so that's a good one. Vitex will probably work in southern Ohio, but that's about it. And it will probably winter kill every year. You can cut it back to the ground, it'll bloom the next year. This is the Vitex Shoal Creek. The Vitex Negundo seems to be a little more attractive to honeybees in my experience. This one's prettier, but the Negundo is a little better for the bees. Sumacs are a native plant. They're a shrub, they're fence row sort of thing, grown up fields, that sort of thing. There's 3 or 4 species in the eastern United States. They produce copious amounts of nectar and pollen. Honeybees absolutely love these things. If you've got a place that you can put them, they're very good for your bees. Very good. They will kind of spread on their own, so you'll either need to mow around them to keep them in place, or you're going to have a great big thicket of them. Buttonbush likes wet places. It'll grow in a swamp. It can take a damp place as well. Blooms in August. great time to have flowers available. It's one of the last ones to leaf out, one of the first ones to lose its leaves in the fall. It may seem like you've got a dead tree till May, and then all of a sudden it leaves out. The blooms are very attractive. A lot of butterflies come to these. It's a really good plant. Seven Suns tree blooms in August, late July, August, and September. This is a distant relative of honeysuckle. It has a kind of a shaggy bark. It's very, very much like a crepe myrtle, but it can live much farther north. It's a fragrant tree. You won't smell it all over the neighborhood, but every time you walk by it, you'll smell it. It's very attractive to bees. I don't know that there are enough in one place for anybody to know whether it's a good honey plant or not. But the bees do work it. Every time I have one that blooms, there are honeybees on it. So that tells me it's got a good sugar content to it. This one was discovered in China, brought back, lost. They brought it back out in the 80s and spread it around a little bit, found out it's a wonderful plant. Reason it's really not often seen in your garden centers is it blooms in August and September when nobody's at the garden center. So they're not going to stock it because there's nobody there to see it blooming. These white flowers are followed by a kind of a reddish, what it looks like an after bloom, but it's the seed pod. And that will hang on till you have a hard freeze in the fall. So down here in the South, this thing's pretty until Thanksgiving some years. So it's a really nice plant. It's not very big, about 20 or 25 feet tall. It grows like a corkscrew. So if you really like straight plants, this is not a good one for you, but it's very attractive and very, has a lot of visual interest to it all year round. All right. I think I will be available for questions after this is over with. And I do appreciate this. And it's always nice to be with the Ohio Beekeepers, whether in person or virtually. So thank you very much.
All right. We have a few questions. You guys had most of the questions answered all the way throughout the entire day. And I'm going to unmute David here. Anyway, thank you for taking the time to answer everybody's questions for us.
You're welcome. I don't know, can you hear me?
Yes, sir. And if you have anything else to add?
The only thing that I know is if you do go to my website right now, my contact page is not working. So you can send me a email at rockbridgetrees@gmail.com. But if you try to work the contact page, you're going to be as frustrated as I am about that. So, but that's I don't want anybody to think that I'm ignoring their questions. It's just not working right now. But no, not really. I mean, everybody's asked nice questions. It's good questions that helped, things that were applied to just about everybody. I don't know if anybody else has anything. I thought it was nice to answer them as they came in instead of having it all pile up at the end. See, there's one there. Anything that's easy to get established and easy keepers, Linden trees and Tulip poplar trees, super easy. Seven Suns is easy. Tree lilac is easy. It's really the ones that I mentioned that were difficult are the ones that are difficult. So let's see, how long does sumac to bloom? If you plant this fall from seed, probably 2 years or so from seed for the sumac. If you can get them to germinate, they're a little hard to germinate. Male and female trees, the website generally talks about male and female trees. Persimmons are male and female, hollies are male and female. A lot of trees have male and female flowers on the same tree, but not open at the same time. Yes, I do sell the trees on my website. And if here's one about how do we propagate Seven Suns trees? If you can figure that out, please let me know. I'm having a hard time doing that myself. And Seven Suns trees get about 20 to 25 feet tall.
All right. Hey, you get ready to leave and you're getting bombarded with a few more questions.
That's right. I love it.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Hughes. We greatly appreciate your time, putting the presentation together and sitting with us this evening.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I hope everything's gone well today.
Everything's wet perfect.